and welcome to this episode of Career Podcasts with Mentorsphere. I'm your host Medha, and together we're going to explore the career journeys, milestones, challenges, and inspiring stories of people across professions. Our guest on today's episode is slightly hatke, a creative powerhouse and also an extremely dear friend. A graphic designer by profession, Pragun Agarwal has been an integral part of design projects for top brands like Dr. Reddy's, Noise, Wildcraft, to name a few, and his work has been featured by the likes of the Washington Post and New York Times. Pragun did his undergraduate design degree from the National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad, and topped it up with a master's from Baltimore. He currently works as a senior designer with design company Landor and Fitch based in Germany and is a seasoned mentor in the design space. We're honored that he's a mentor with Mentorsphere and has offered time to chat with us on this episode of Career Podcasts. Welcome to the show, Pragun.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Excited.
Super. So, Pragun, I have to ask you because I've known you for years. You were someone who was clear about, what your career trajectory would look like from pretty much day one, which is a rarity for someone looking to enter a field, as left of center or offbeat as graphic design. Could you walk us through what your career decision-making process looked like back in the day?
It's funny you say that. I had clarity. I did. It's like we're all on the same boat from that perspective that you go into class 10 pretty much with the same subjects and then you have the same confusion in life. There's a difference between knowing I wanted to do graphic design and there's also the fact that I really love to draw. I credit my mother for putting me in these art classes, which I went ever since I was a child. And I never let that go. You let go of certain hobbies because you either outgrow them or you were not as interested. But something about sketching and drawing, there's a really gradual evolution. And every year, I was seeing it evolve. And the sketching was becoming more interesting, engaging. I was trying different forms of art in the sense that I was experimenting with drawing. And that never left me. So when I went into class 10 with this sort of interest in drawing, I wouldn't say I was so sure I want to drop everything and take arts and, get into fine arts. So I did still take science. I had science with economics because I wasn't sure how I could translate a skill into a career at that point of time. I kept gauging my skill into, say, the art club. I started going for a few competitions, winning some, and I realized, okay, this is not just a hobby. This is something that I can actually build something on. Right. So in class 12, I dropped economics, took fine arts, do a bit more of commercial art. I know in school, we used to have these school boards for different events and festivals. Right. And it might sound very trivial today, but that was all part of designing because you had a brief. And then you were able to deliver. And by end of 11th, 12th, I was able to say, okay, now how do I translate my drawing or this affinity towards sketching into a career? And at that point of time, there were a couple of options. There was still engineering because there's something called engineering drawing, which is also product design, industrial design. Then there was architecture, which was something that I feel like I was quite interested in. And then the last thing was design because I was sure that, honestly, I didn't know what graphic design was in class 12. I knew that I like the sense of creativity. I know that interested me to think of things conceptually and draw and this, but I wasn't sure what graphic design is. And I'm in awe of people who already know graphic design in class 11, what it stands for and what it means. I personally feel there's a beauty in not knowing as well because you are going into any kind of field, a slightly raw perspective, but you're sure that you're able to build something on it. So I did all my AI triple-Es with the engineering drawing. I even took architecture coaching. I got into a couple of architecture schools and I took this one long shot with NID. As luck has it, I got through NID and then there was no looking back.
Pragun, from your career trajectory, I see two very obvious inflection points. One is obviously at the point where, you figured that design is what you want to do, but you want to understand the various facets it involves and what you could make with it going forward. And then, of course, the obvious choice was to say that, do I want to get into graphic design or should I be doing maybe architecture? And these are spaces where you don't really always have too many people in your immediate network or surrounding to sort of reach out to and sort of have a chat from a practical, first-hand standpoint. Did you struggle with that?
Yeah, 100%. So when we think about guidance, we think about family immediately. I come from a business family. There's no one I can think of who can directly help me. Yes, I have some architects in the family, but how did I come up with that decision? It's a lot about the repertoire, what the school stands for, what the ideals are. And NID being an institute that was set up in the 1960s by Nehru, and it was one of the first. It just gives it that stature, has that backing and background. And it's something quite historic to So that was a really nice driver for me to push for. How do you convince a really strong business
Truly,
family, I want
truly.
to go into career like design? Then that helps a lot,
Yeah.
because not just a career, but where you're going and what that stands for. What are the people coming out of this college creating as students,
Interesting.
as young designers, and then eventually as with professional practices. And whatever came out of NID was so inspiring. I think all these things were helping me decide better and be less confused.
Pragun, I want to take you back a few steps to the point where you were convincing your parents about entering the design space. Even till today, there are some strange stereotypes associated with, picking up design as a career. Baseless beliefs that, artistic or creative fields are primarily for women or designers don't make money. Have you at all faced or heard these stereotypes, from people around when you were making this decision?
Firstly, yes, 100% from family and from friends. And to my surprise, even from teachers from our own
Wow.
school, the first stereotype is, okay, you're doing design. Is it fashion design? Right? That's the first stereotype. And then you're like, it's exactly what you said. Is that only for women? Right?
Yeah.
Are you going to be making costumes? Are you going to NIFT instead of NID? What is NID? Is NID NIT? You mean national? All these things used to happen because people still don't know about NID. It doesn't bother me anymore because I'm able to make them understand where it comes from. But yeah, there are lots of these misconceptions about design, but also about what designers do. People have this assumption about, okay, designers are a bit free and hippie and they don't have their dressing sense is wild and they have a crazy mind and maybe they're onto something or they're having something to be creative. It was so confusing for me. I will always say that it's my own career and I have to do it the way I want. These people never went to these colleges.
True. That's the biggest convincing point, right?
Yeah, if a person in my family was a designer from any of these colleges and he's telling my parents, don't let them go there, I come from experience, I would pay attention to that statement.
Yeah.
There is some meat in what they say. I know it's an investment, I know it's a big thing in your life, but keep your ears open in the sense that where are they coming from? Are they coming from an informed space? Are they coming from an aware space? And if they do, yes, there's merit in what they're saying.
For the benefit of people listening to this podcast who might have a slight bit of interest in design or maybe graphic design in particular, or are on edge about it and confused, could you sort of give our listeners a bit of a visualization in terms of what graphic design actually entails, what its subsets would look like, and maybe what a designer would typically be doing on job?
I start off with saying that back then, we had mobile phones and we had computers, but there was not this social media or digital boom per se, right?
True.
So with that onset of digital devices, formats, there also came that much of a need to design all of that. Right. That's why there's also an awareness, and that's why there's also a demand of a lot of designers, graphic designers, web designers, and everything.
Right.
In graphic designers, this idea of visual communication. It has aspects of animation, it has aspects of digital design, which includes user interface, user experience. And then you have also film, you also have branding and identity, have publication, which goes into print. So it has many, many fields. Now you can also classify this as visual communication. You can also classify this as graphic design because graphic designers sometimes are doing all of these things as well.
Yeah.
But conventionally, more from a textbook perspective, graphic design is to do with symbols, icons, and logos. It's to do with communicating more from a static or from a publication perspective. So, graphic design, animation design, film and video, exhibition design, and so on and so forth. For me, one of the most essential ingredient of graphic design is typography. Typography is so vast. It could mean that you're designing a font. It could mean you're doing calligraphy. It's very functional. You are typesetting books, right? Who makes these books that are in the bookstore? It's done by a graphic designer because they understand typography and fonts and how it should look.
Back in the day, I think I was looking at the back of a medicine strip and I remember thinking that, why am I not able to read the expiry or the manufacturing or even the top 5 ingredients are always the most important. I'm not able to read these. And I remember vaguely mentioning it to you and you said that, Medha, that's something a designer does. And that just blows my mind. So there's concept and design in nearly every communication. So I think that pretty much sums up what you said.
Absolutely. Like I mentioned, right? Like we come into an ID just having a good skill of drawing, sketching. Some people have a good skill of clay, a sculpture. But what you realize when you come into NIT is that you firstly understand the difference between art and design. And The most rudimentary or the most raw way of saying it is that art is for yourself, design is for others. That's why your medicine strip example makes so much sense. Because yes, you want to make everything look aesthetic and beautiful, but it has to be functional.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it for someone who's, just sort of dabbling in the space, trying to figure out whether design or graphic design in particular is meant for them. You touched upon NID life. If you had to sort of sum up in a nutshell what life at NID was, what would that be? And how do you think it's impacted the designer in you today?
I think NID has the most sort of massive role to play in what I am today, more than my master's as well. Because you go into college as an 18-year-old, like very raw. And
Right.
I guess it was a space which was very inclusive. It made me very grounded as a person because we had students from 80% of the states. We were 500 on campus, but it was a very, very tight knit community. I can still probably know a lot of people, but my experience was very organic, very inclusive, and you're just molded in the right way, and you're very open to ideas. You are constantly soaking in information, you're soaking in a lot of things you see.
It's a bit like this feeling of coming to the mothership, right? When you're around people who resonate with the sentiment and the spirit in which you do what you do and your passion for your subject. I think it must be a feeling of being very settled when you're
Absolutely.
around those people.
I think there's so much like-mindedness, there's so much understanding,
Yeah.
Otherwise, at times as a creative, you feel like a bit different because you're not perceiving or doing education in the same way other people are doing.
Obviously.
We didn't have like exams, we didn't have lectures, we had classes, we had assignments, we had a lot of hands-on stuff, but we had juries, and it was a very different way of assessment.
Correct.
So it really opens you up, which is very important as a creative.
Yeah.
You're constantly challenging yourself, you're constantly seeing things and assessing yourself a lot more.
Pragun, you've done work across, design companies, you freelanced with brands. And I generally noticed that the typical trajectory of a lot of designers is quite similar, a sort of a mixed bag of a full-time role at a design company or with a brand coupled with freelance gigs. Is this a tactical call that designers take from a monetary perspective or a modalities perspective? How does a designer really create a watertight career trajectory?
It's a really interesting question because, in my opinion, if you go to a good studio or a good company, it's not like you can't freelance, but your trajectory in terms of from a financial perspective and your trajectory as a creative in terms of mentoring should be enough and should be inspiring enough that you don't freelance.
Interesting.
I've been lucky enough to work in 3 creative agencies. During the time when I was there, I started as an intern and I left as a senior designer, and during which I hardly freelanced. I did like small things for my family, some cards or whatever. You'll never say no to that. I won't say there's no time to freelance, but rather as a creative, you should be able to grow within that space. I think, yes, money is very important. I would never deny it. If someone has to freelance to make ends meet, I think you have to make your ends meet. But it's not a set rule, I think, in graphic design or design. Because if you go to a company that's mentoring you well, that has a great energy, that also is, inspiring you, you are constantly debating, you're constantly having good critique about design, you're also seeing good design. I think that's part of the growth. So if you freelance on the side and you're doing quick freelances because you feel like that's the way the growth will be, yes, you learn something from a freelance, but the question is it actually making you grow? That's not always
Is a
the
great question
case.
to ask.
Yes.
Yeah, true. And also, speaking of which, the creative space is one where you always need to keep your ideas fresh. You need to harness originality at all times. It can actually be quite tiring and exhausting to be producing something great each day at work. You can't afford to have that kind of a lapse because it's a creative field at the end of the day. How do you unwind and hit back with fresher ideas?
Again, a very interesting questions because I didn't freelance much when I was, post my bachelor's. Like I worked for about 3.5 years, but I did go home and then work. And this was probably building my skill of calligraphy or lettering, something that's very integral to my work today. My way of unwinding was to learn a new skill, but not essentially freelance and make more money. The question is, why this skill? And this is something quite personal, like why I started doing this. You're quite tired, you're like working your 9-10 hours and coming
And you deserve a
home.
break.
Yeah, you deserve a break. But there was a certain drive in me to make something personal. What happens is when you work at any agency, whether it's a agency of 3 people or 30 people, I feel when a project goes out and live in the world, it's lovely to see it go live. And sometimes it might take a month, sometimes it might take 2 years. But that sense of identity where you can say what I made is truly mine, not always comes through, right? Because you're a part of a bigger team always. So my drive or my way to unwind or to make something more ownable was to go home and try and learn a skill. And learning a skill is also a way to unwind, because with Instagram coming up that time, I felt like this is a nice goal for me. This is a nice way to put out. And I think that was something I think was a way to unwind then. I think a lot happens between your 9 to 6, and I'm working in Germany, so it is pretty much 9 to 6. But post 9 to 6, I feel like my way of unwinding is probably a bit different now. I would love to learn more skills, but maybe a walk or a run or something else is also something I look forward to now. But as someone who's growing up, who's a bit raw, who wants to learn a lot more, who has a lot of ambition, I think learning a new skill was the answer for me.
It's a lot easier to make time for something like that because passion is of a very different nature in those initial days. It's not that it dies down, but it sort of matures over time.
Yeah.
So,
And just to add to that, most creative agencies will always help you if you go up to them and you have a reasonable discussion with your boss or with the creative director and say, listen, I'm really interested in this. I'll give an example. So someone's really interested in learning 3D softwares, or someone's really interested in learning motion design. They might even help you, like, I don't know, sponsor a LinkedIn program for you, or probably access to, say, even an event. This is a very common thing to do. Whenever you join an agency, you must talk about your interests. And good agencies always help you develop those interests. So it's another great way to have that conversation. It's very important to have that conversation and tell your boss, listen, I feel like I can benefit. Why would he want to invest in you? Because probably he also sees that you're able to apply that skill into their work as well.
Correct. Pragun, if I can ask you, what's your biggest challenge as a designer?
My biggest challenge is because of Instagram and because of social media, you're always sort of enmeshed with amazing design.
Yeah.
And my biggest challenge is I want to do that. And I really struggle not be able to push myself enough. That's my biggest challenge. Like, because you're always constantly wanting to do the best and being the most creative and learn all these skills and softwares. So my biggest challenge today is to take out that time to do that. But I've always been told not to be that hard on yourself. But as a creative, you'll always be surrounded by great work. And it's important to find your voice. And it's important to find it in the right way. And I think that's how I kind of mellow down that pressure.
Your golden advice of saying that, work on your skills and build something that's personal to you that you completely own and that sets you apart from others could be that great differentiating factor and could mellow down this feeling to a great deal. And I know you've done that, of course. Typography is a focus and has remained a focus throughout your work. So that's a very clear, demarcated differential that you bring to anything that you do.
Yeah. And that holds true even today. Like in an agency, then people start recognizing your skill as well.
As the
So
guy
it
who
works
does
both
that.
ways.
Is there really a dream project or a final focus that all this effort is going up to, or are you the sort of person who enjoys the process more?
One of my ex-creative director bosses said that for a graphic designer, this is very conventionally, I think he said that there are 4 corporate areas. One is aviation, banking, probably like alcoholic beverage brand. And the last one was probably like a sports label. But those are like the dream projects for a graphic designer, because that kind of sets your career. I mean, it's quite iconic to think of these spaces, right? But this was also, I would say, 10 years back. Today, I would say the ambition and the drive and the sort of dream project, like you said, might have changed. For me, it's become constantly asking yourself as a graphic designer, what are you really doing, right? Like you're creating logos and then, it's going into the same corporate world again. For me, a dream would be to sort of make that difference, right? Like to do a project or to have a branding and an identity that probably benefits someone or the earth, and not part of this typical template of sorts. So my ambition would be to probably even do a pro bono. But if I know that, okay, this really has that value and it might actually make a bit of a difference, and I see that difference. So these dream projects evolve as well over
Of
time.
course. Everybody wants their work to be remembered and for the right reasons. I think the legacy that you think of is a great one.
Your perception about what you're doing also changes and evolves.
Correct.
I consider my job as a service today, because you come from a student perspective where you're like, I will change the world. And then you realize, okay, at the end of the day, yes, I can and I should, but also this is a job. I have to deliver something between
That's
9
so
to 6 as
practical.
well.
Yeah, that's I think the difference between what someone 2 or 3 years into the industry versus someone 6, 7 years plus would say. And that makes a lot of sense because eventually you've got to get there. Like as we discussed, the passion sort of matures over time and it doesn't die down, but it takes up a more mature form.
Exactly. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have that drive. You should always have that drive. I still have that drive. But at the same time, there's a space and time for that drive too. If I go into my work every day and I constantly am feeling like I'm just making a logo, I won't be excited, but it will evolve, it will mature, and you just have to believe in the power of design or graphic design.
You're a seasoned mentor in the design space already. If there are one or two top qualities that you think people entering your space should hone or should at least come with, what would those be?
Right. I think one thing that really helped me was to be quite organic about my design career. I didn't come in knowing so much about design. And that comes to my first point, which is to be very open-minded. I think if you come in today saying, okay, I want to do branding, and 5 years later, branding will remain, but there's something else that interests you more, you have to be open-minded towards it. And I think as a creative, you have to do that. I think secondly, I would say that be at it. Like someone said this, or was it, I think it was Seth Roden. Yeah, Seth Roden speaks a lot about marketing, and he's a brilliant speaker. But you know how we say that we have a creative block? He says, first show me those 1,000 sketches. Because it's really important to understand that design is also a lot about doing. And it's about reaching somewhere once you've done that process. You won't ever ask a carpenter or a plumber. There's nothing like a plumber block or a carpenter block, right? At the end of the day, you have to keep at it and keep doing it to say, okay, now, okay, you might still not reach a solution, but then you'll have 1,000 things to show why you didn't. And I feel like as a student, get too sort of familiar and be like, okay, like, I'll go directly and make a logo in one go and do it. Yeah, it might work once, it won't work all the time. I don't do one thing, I do 1,000 and then select one and then develop one. There are always going to be commitments and deliverables that your design eventually is tied. So to strike that balance and understand that while you are a creative, you are a professional at the same time, brings me back to the golden line you said about understanding the difference between art and design, which is the ABC of being in this space. You're an artist, obviously at starting point, but eventually you have to grow into that designer who's a professional. Exactly. Pragun, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. I've always been intrigued by your work. I think what comes through in this podcast is this infectious energy with which you convey your love for your craft. And it's not just this love for your craft that comes from a place of passion and, love for the art form, but it comes from a place of loving the professional aspect of being a designer, which is so beautiful and so incredibly important for someone entering your space. Of course, it was a pleasure, and always, happy to be here and looking forward to mentoring. Thanks, Pragun. For the benefit of our listeners, Pragun offers mentoring hours on our platform, Mentorsphere. Are you someone who's looking to build a career as a graphic designer? Chat with Pragun today and clear your career doubts. And we'll meet on the next episode of Career Podcasts with Mentorsphere.